Let's find the reduced echelon, row echelon form of this matrix. The first step we need to do is to get zeros below, right? So we're going to first get our matrix into echelon form, and then after we do that, we put it into the reduced echelon form. So I need to find my first pivot location. Because that first column's not 0, we know there's going to be a pivot at the top. If that number wasn't 0, I'd swap rows. I don't need to swap rows here because it already is 0. So I'm going to go ahead and use that pivot to make both entries below it a 0. So to make this first entry below it, that 2 is 0, I can do R2 minus R1 and stick that into R2. So I'm going to leave my R1 the same as it was before. I'm going to do R2 minus R1 to get my new row. So I'm going to get 0, 1, 3, 2, 14. And then we'll leave the bottom the same as it was before. Next, I again need to use the same pivot to make its other entry below it, that -4 a 0. So to do that, I can do R3 plus 2 R1 and pop that into R3. If we need to show our work a little bit, just to make sure we don't make any algebra mistakes, I can take this R3 here, put it kind of down below. Below that, I'm going to write 2 times my R1. So I get 4, 2, 14, 2, and 30. And now I just need to add those two together. So working with the matrix we had before, we know the first 2 rows are going to stay the same. So I can put that there. And now I just get this new third row, which adding these gives me 0, 0, 0, 2, and then 10. So now we'll kind of want to check and see where we're at. We have our first 2 here. It's got zeros below it. Now we move over to that first row, that's that leading entry. I go down to my next row, I find its leading entry. That also has a 0 below it. And then I go down to my third row, I find its leading entry, and there's nothing below that. So that's fine. And so this means I'm already in echelon form, which we can also call row echelon form. Either of those is fine. Now that you're in echelon form, to get down to that reduced echelon form, you've got to get zeros above those pivots. So I need these 2 entries to be 0, as well as this entry. So again, it's those entries that need to become zeros to get into reduced echelon form. I also need the pivots themselves, that 2, that 1, and that 2, to be 1. I can go ahead and divide each row by constants to make those ones, but I don't want to do that if it's going to cost me having to use fractions, because that's going to be a way that you might get some algebraic errors. So right now, I could take this bottom row and divide it by 2, or I don't have to. You can kind of decide for yourself what's going to make the most sense. So maybe because I noticed that in R2 I already have a 2, I could leave R3 the way it is at first. So I can use this pivot. Again, it's always important to use the pivots. So to get this one to be a 0, I need to use the pivot, use that square 2 to do that. So I can do R2 minus R3 and pop that into R2. So again, R1 stays the same. Nothing's changing. I'm going to take row 2. I'm going to look at that row. I'm going to subtract off row 3, and I'm going to put that into row 2 here. So I get 0 minus 0, 0, 1 minus 0, 1, 3 minus 0, 3, 2 minus 2, 0, 14 minus 10, 4. And then I still have that 0, 0, 2, one extra 0 there, 2, 10. Go ahead and just make this pink to highlight that this is the one that we just changed in this step. Okay, so again, here are my pivots, those leading entries in each row. I've made this one have 1 0 above it, and now I need to make the next one above it 0. When we're doing this reduced echelon form and we're getting zeros above, you have to work right to left. So we had to do this one first, and then we'll do this one second, and then we'll come back over here and do this one third. If we tried to do this one before the other twos, we're going to notice that when we do the other two, we're going to mess that one up. All right, so now I need to get this next entry, this 1, to be a 0. And in that case, it might be easier if this pivot down here was a 1, and I can do that without getting any fractions. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my R3 and I'm going to divide it by 2 and stick that into R3. So my R3 becomes 0, 0, 0, 1, 5. I'm not changing anything else at this stage. I still have that 0, 1, 3, 0, 4, and that 2, 1, 7, 1, 15. So I just made it so that that pivot, that leading entry in the bottom row, was a 1 because I could do that without creating any fractions. And now I can do R1 minus R3 and stick that into R1, and that's going to make this entry here a 0. So I get R1 minus R3, 2, 1, 7, 0. There's a 15 up there. Let's fix that. So that gives me 10. And then I still have, again, let's maybe keep these so we can designate which one we're looking at. Let's color code. There we go. Okay. And then everything else stays the same. 0, 1, 3, 0, 4. And then 0, 0, 0, 1, 5. So now we're looking pretty good. We've got pivot, 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 all those zeros below, got my 2 zeros above. So the last step is to make this 1 a 0. And again, you have to use the pivot in order to do that. So not quite the last step, we've got one more step after that. So then we're going to do R1 minus R2 and stick that into R1. So that gives us 2, 0, 4, 0, 6, and then 0, 1, 3, 0, 4, and 0, 0, 0, 1, 5. So again, let's see where we're at. Pivot, pivot, pivot. 0 is below, 0 is above. Great. The only last thing we need to do is make sure each of those pivots is a 1. The bottom two are, the top one just needs to be a 1. So to do that, I can just take that top row and divide it by 2 and stick it into that row. So finally, I get 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 1, 3, 0, 4, 0, 0, 0, 1, 5. And this is going to be in that reduced echelon form. Each of my pivots are 1. Remember, pivots are the first non-zero entry in each row. Below those pivots, we have zeros. That gets us an echelon form. Above those pivots are zeros. That's that reduced echelon form. And so together with zeros above and below, and each pivot being 1, that's all we need to do to check that we're in that echelon form, reduced echelon form. And so then this is our final answer here.